Greetings fellow slayers and newcomers alike. Today we are creating the ultimate Corvo Attano build in Baldur's Gate 3. This one's a bit tricky as with most character builds, and there are some variations in how to go about it. Today's version will do most of what Corvo does in Dishonored, minus a couple abilities like the Rat Swarm or Possession. For Possession, there's nothing in the game that lets you actually do what it does in Dishonored, but I suppose you could argue the Dominate spells could work, but I'm not too worried about it. And the only thing in this game I could see kind of like Rat Swarm is Insect Plague, but that's more like the Blood Flies, and you'd have to take Cleric, Druid, or Sorcerer to level 9, which we are not going to do today. Consider subscribing before you click off, as this build will be 3 Rogue, 5 Warlock, and 4 Fighter, with a respec somewhere in between. Leave a comment down below with any suggestions for future builds, and for access to the written version of Corvo Attano as well as my full catalog of builds, consider visiting the Patreon where these lovely folk have gathered round. Thank you all for your support. You all are absolute legends, and may you receive the buffed up bless from the staff of Arcane Blessing. Welcome to Purge Evil. Thank you for stopping by. Let's get into it. Character creation in level 1. To begin, human for the race, or you could choose Wood Elf for extra stealth proficiency and movement speed. Take Urchin as your background for extra stealth regardless. We start the game as a rogue, granting us sneak attack and extra skill points. Make sure to buff your stealth, acrobatics, possibly athletics, insight, and perception. For stats, set strength to 10, dex to 14, constitution to 16, intelligence to 8, wisdom to 8, and charisma at 17. Level 2. At Rogue 2, we gain our bonus action Hide, Dash, and Disengage. Level 3. Now at level 3, Rogue 3, our sneak attack now deals a bonus 2d6 damage, and we unlock our subclass, which will, of course, be Assassin. This subclass grants you a few busted features for abusing the game's stealth system and is centered around ambushing. First, you now have advantage against any creatures who haven't taken a turn, which is perfect because by ambushing enemies, they will always be surprised. So you basically have free reign even if not in stealth on the first turn of combat. To ambush enemies, you simply just have to attack from stealth. This leads into our second passive, Ambush, which causes any successful attack roll against a surprised creature to be a critical hit. After ambushing, this will initiate combat in which enemies will be surprised, and usually you would lose out on the action you used to attack, but with our third passive, we now immediately regain both our action and bonus action at the start of every combat encounter, even if we initiated using one. This can be used to completely cheese the game by entering combat, dealing insane damage, then hiding away and leaving combat with a rinse and repeat. Level 4. At level 4, we multi-class into Warlock to really start to become Corvo Attano with our supernatural powers. As a quick note, around this time, consider acquiring the Hag's Hair for a +1 to Charisma, but be careful in saving Mayrina, as we do want the Duelist Prerogative by Act 3. As another quick note, we will not be gaining Wind Blast, i.e. Thunder Wave, through leveling, instead relying on the Ring of Absolute Force, so make sure to get the Brand of the Absolute. You can also acquire the Thunder Palm Strikers in Act 3, which cast Thunder Wave as a level 3 spell. There are multiple ways to get Thunder Wave, but I didn't want to sacrifice any levels, passives, or spells for it. With that being said, there will be a time where we can take Shatter as sort of an alternative. Take the Great Old One for Mortal Reminder, which has a chance to frighten nearby enemies after landing a critical hit. For cantrips, Eldritch Blast for every Warlock, but headcanon it as a pistol, and Minor Illusion headcanon as summoning a rat for distraction. For spells, take Hex to deal more damage to enemies, and Armor of Agathis in case you get hit. Level 5. At level 5, Warlock 2, we gain 2 Eldritch Invocations, taking Agonizing Blast for gun damage and Devil's Sight for dark vision. For our spell, take Arms of Hadar, as it really is just good, especially for a rogue. It does great damage, but it also inflicts a condition on enemies that prevent them from making reactions, allowing Corvo to escape from a group of surrounding enemies while also dealing some damage instead of just straight up disengaging. Level 6. At level 6 Warlock 3, we now unlock our Pact boon, which will of course be Pact of the Blade. So now all of our attacks with our main hand weapon will scale with charisma rather than dex or strength. If you're dual wielding, the offhand weapon will still scale with dex, so take note of that. Make sure to keep your weapon bound at all times. For the spell, we will take Darkness. Whenever you're not abusing the assassin passives, we can now cast Darkness and just headcanon this as Corvo's capabilities of stealth and breaking line of sight. The entire game can be completed from within a cloud of darkness with relative ease. For the replacement spell, Hex becomes less useful over time and requires concentration, so ditch that in favor of Corvo's Blink, which in Baldur's Gate 3 is Misty Step. We already have this with gear by this point, but now we have it naturally as well. A better blink would be Shadow Step from Monk 6, and you could possibly build a Corvo Attano with Monk, though we won't be diving into that today as it would be a completely separate build, and it would kind of be similar to the next build, which is the Ball Assassin. Note that our Warlock spell slots are now level 2 as well. Level 7. Now at level 7 Warlock 4, we gain our first feat with ability improvement, increasing our charisma by 2, capping it at 20 if you've acquired the Hag's Hair. For the cantrip, take Blade Ward as a just in case if you feel you might take damage, and for spell, you can either take Hold Person or Mirror Image as a bend time spell, or Shatter as a form of Wind Blast. Hold Person being the strongest of course, but it does require concentration, which you may likely already be using for Darkness. Otherwise, this gives you and allies free criticals on the target within melee range and can be absolutely abused. Mirror Image, on the other hand, can be cast freely as it doesn't require concentration and essentially guarantees you won't take damage for 3 attacks. And lastly, Shatter is a simple thunder damage spell that we can headcanon as Wind Blast. It does decent damage to be fair and is usually reliable. Level 8. Now at level 8, we take our final level into Warlock, unlocking extra attack and gaining level 3 Warlock spells. Our Eldritch Invocation will grant us another bend time ability with Mire the Mind Slow. This is quite powerful, casting on up to 6 enemies. They can only take an action or a bonus action, can only attack once per turn, cannot take reactions, and spells they cast might be delayed for a turn. On top of this, their AC and Dex saving throws are reduced by 2. For the spell, take Counterspell for a just-in-case defense or a recommended spell from the previous level. Level 9. At level 9, take a walk back to camp and visit Withers for a respec. Make sure to put your first level into Fighter for Constitution proficiency. We also gain second wind for a self-heal. The fighting style is your choice between dueling and 2-weapon fighting. This will depend on your gear, but if you get the Ballist armor, I would highly recommend getting dueling. Fill the rest of your levels with the levels we just discussed, 3 Rogue and 5 Warlock. Level 10. At level 10, we take Fighter 2 and gain Action Surge, which can be either headcanon as Corvo's speed or even another bend time, allowing Corvo to take a second action and even a second extra attack before anyone else can. Level 11. At level 11, we take Fighter 3, unlocking the Champion subclass, further reducing our number needed to crit by 1. By this point in the build, that number is significantly lowered through gear already. Level 12. And at level 12, you can put your last level into any of the 3 classes we've taken. I chose Fighter for the extra health tick, and for the feat, I took Alert for a +5 initiative and surprise immunity, just in time for those Ball Assassins, who as mentioned before, will actually be next week's build and is currently available on the Patreon. Alternatively, take Savage Attacker. Gear. Bunch of sneaky stuff. Locations of all gear can easily be found on the Baldur's Gate 3 wiki or on my Patreon. Now for Act 1 head, first we have the Shadow of Menzo Berenzin, of course, which allows you to go invisible with Shrouded in Shadow. And then we have the Shade Spell Circlet. No cloaks unless you're the Dark Urge. You would get the Deathstalker Mantle, of course. And for chest pieces, first we have the Spider Silk Armor, and I spawned this one in using the console commands, so it doesn't actually have the advantage to Constitution saving throws as it usually would. You'll get this off of Minthara. And then we also have the Graceful Cloth. For gloves, we have Fleet Fingers, but more so, we have the Gloves of Dexterity. For boots, we have the Disintegrating Nightwalkers, and you'll wear these for the entire game as they give you Misty Step, which is blink of course. And then moving on to amulets, we have the Amulet of Misty Step of course, and then the Amulet of Branding, which you can use to make enemies vulnerable to piercing, which is the main damage type we will be dealing. For the rings, we have the Ring of Absolute Force with Thunder Wave to give you the Wind Blast, and the Strange Conduit Ring, which while concentrating gives your weapon attacks a bonus 1d4 psychic damage. For melee weapons, the main one you want to get is the Knife of the Undermountain King, which is actually a short sword and reduces the number you need to roll a critical hit by 1. We also have the Baneful and the Ritual Dagger, which isn't here, but do take note of that. And then being as we are Corvo Attano, of course we have to use hand crossbows, so make sure to pick up the Fire Stoker. Now for Act 2 heads, we have the Covert Cowl first, which reduces your critical hit number again. And then we have the Dark Justiciar helmet later on, which reduces your critical hit number as well, but also gives you a +1 bonus to Constitution saving throws. For cloaks in Act 2, we have to get the Cloak of Cunning Broom, which whenever you disengage creates a fog cloud in a 2-meter radius. And then for chest pieces, we have the Shade Clinger armor and the Penumbral armor. And if you're going an evil route, you can of course get the Dark Justiciar half plate, though this is entirely optional of course. For gloves, I like to wear the Gloves of the Duelist if I'm not wearing the Gloves of Dexterity, as they give you a +2 bonus to melee weapon attack rolls if you're only wielding one in your main hand. We also have the Gloves of Balanced Hands, since at this point in the build we won't have 2-weapon fighting just yet, and if you are using 2 weapons, this will help you out, or you could just wear the Gloves of Dexterity still. And then we have the Dark Justiciar Gauntlets, of course, giving our weapon attacks a bonus 1d4 necrotic damage. And then for boots in Act 2, entirely optional as you have to kill the Night Song, we have the Dark Justiciar Boots, which gives you another version of Blink. For amulets, of course, we have the Surgeon's Subjugation Amulet, which once per long rest, when scoring a critical hit, you can paralyze the target for 2 turns. Not entirely necessary, but is useful. I tend to stick with the Amulet of Misty Step anyways, or the Amulet of Branding. And then for rings, we have the mightily important Shadow Cloaked Ring. This causes your weapon to deal an additional 1d4 damage against lightly or heavily obscured creatures and creatures made of shadow. And then we also have the Shifting Corpus Ring, which allows you to go invisible or use the blur spell. And then being that we use hand bows, we have to get the Hellfire Hand Crossbow, which synergizes perfectly with stealth builds as it can possibly inflict burning when hitting a creature with this weapon while hiding or invisible. You want this in your main hand and then put the Fire Stoker in your offhand to deal an additional 1d4 piercing damage to that burning target after you've hit it from stealth. Now for Act 3, for helmets, we can put on the Birthright, but I usually stick with the Dark Justiciar helmet as we get the reduced critical number from it, but do note that it does increase your charisma by 2, so it can be useful. And then we have the Shade Slayer Cloak, which is absolutely necessary, reducing our critical by another 1. All of these effects stack, by the way. For chest, we have the Elegant Studded Leather, and if you're so keen to get it, we have the phenomenal Ballist Armor, which whenever you get within 2 meters of any enemy, they become vulnerable. And the description says unless they are resistant or immune to it, but this isn't actually the case. Everybody will become vulnerable to piercing damage. You also gain a +2 bonus to initiative rolls. For gloves, you could get the Thunder Palm Strikers for another Wind Blast, and for boots, we have the Helldusk Boots for another version of Blink, though I usually still stick with Disintegrating Nightwalkers. In Act 3, you can get the Ring of Blink, which is the actual Blink spell, though I've never really had a good time using this spell. That's up to you. It's just an option. For the main weapon that I like to use with this build, we have the Duelist's Prerogative. Don't mind the damage right there. That will increase heavily whenever you bind packed weapon. Whenever you wield this with nothing in your offhand, it reduces your critical number by another 1. This doesn't say it stacks in the description, but it does. You also gain an additional reaction per turn, and whenever you hit an enemy, you can use a reaction to deal additional necrotic damage equal to your proficiency bonus, which by the end of the build will be +4. This weapon also allows you to use a regular weapon attack using a bonus action, so if you don't want to take Assassin as your subclass, you could take Thief and kind of abuse it there, but I still find Assassin to be more useful for this build in particular. Anyways, if you can get it, this is the best weapon for this build in my opinion, especially if you're able to get the Ball Ballist Armor. Another weapon that synergizes particularly well with the Ballist Armor is the Crimson Mischief, or the Amulet of Branding if you're so keen on using that. And then we have the Bloodthirst, which is another weapon that decreases the critical hit number by 1. If you don't have the Ballist Armor, this is the weapon that I would recommend using, as whenever you hit an enemy with it, it causes them to become vulnerable to piercing damage. If you can't get the Ballist Armor, I would consider dual wielding rather than dueling. And for a nice optional melee weapon, we have the Stillmaker, which gives you a level 3 version of Hold Person, allowing you to hold 2 people instead of 1. And for the in-game gear that I would equip for Corvo Attano, for the most part, if I have the Ballist Armor, this is what I would be wearing: the Dark Justiciar helmet, the Shadeslayer cloak, the Ballist Armor, the Gloves of the Duelist or Gloves of Dexterity depending on your situation, the Disintegrating Nightwalkers, the Amulet of Misty Step, the Strange Conduit Ring, the Shadow Cloaked Ring, the Duelist Prerogative, the Hellfire Hand Crossbow, and the Firestoker. If you made it to this point in the video, you are now obligated to like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you thought this build was trash, you are now obligated to dislike the video and come up with something better in the comments. Both of you are now obligated to ring the bell so as to not miss out on future content. If you'd like to further support the cause and become a fellow slayer of Purge Evil, the Patreon is linked down below, where you can support for as little as $1 a month and gain access to exclusive content, including all of my builds in written format, plus way more that will never become videos. This includes other games as well, fresh provisions in the pantry, and a new shiny sword for any slayer to be. I got a lot more to share with you all in due time, and if you're still here, I just want to say thank you for stopping by, and until next time, Purge Evil.
Oh yeah, crown in my palm, but I ain't put it on. Yeah, crown in my palm, but I ain't put it on. Yeah, crown in my palm, but I ain't put it on. Yeah, crown in my palm, but I ain't put it on. Yeah.